Good morning. We are in Ezekiel 38 and 39 this morning. This is lesson 4 of part 2 of Ezekiel, and we call it part 2A because we are just going to do the first 3 days of the homework, which are basically the mechanical pieces. We are going to outline these 2 chapters, get our titles and get our paragraph outlines, and hopefully I'm going to be able to pull out some of the things that I feel like are the most important for you to pay attention to and have notice, and you probably all did, and yay. But we want to do that together, and then what we will do next week is follow on, and we will dive deeper into looking at who are these nations. So we're not going to talk about who is Gog and who is Magog and all that. This week we're going to just talk about what is it telling us so that we can be kind of abstract from it. You want to be able to pull back first and just fundamentally be objective about the facts, because sometimes if you go too quickly into saying who is this and where is that on the map, and then what happens is you lose sight of what the message really is. And you want to get the message first, because that way you're objective about what you're seeing. You're not caring about who it might be. You're just saying this is what God is telling us is going to happen. And once we get those pieces laid down, then we can start using our inductive skills to lay pieces together to give further insight, to highlight, or to even connect things. I spoke with Susan yesterday morning in Sunday school class about the things that we're looking at here in 38 and 39. And I had told her I went back to 36, 37, 38, and 39. And I laid out for myself what I call a synoptic gospel observation sheet on those 4 chapters. I went in, and I'm telling you this now up front so I don't forget to tell you at the end, which I will. If you have an opportunity to do this, this is what I did. I just made myself four columns, and I picked out the passages from each of those 4 chapters that speak of the time of this end, when it says, and then they will know that I am the Lord. That is a phrase that Kay has been telling us from the beginning. Pick up on that. Keep a running list of what it is that you're learning about, and then they will know that I am the Lord. Because the coolest thing is starting to really materialize for us at this point is when in history is that time when they will know that He is the Lord, right? We know that we come to know the Lord by the Spirit and through belief on Jesus Christ. But is that the time that's being spoken of here in Ezekiel, and then they will know that I am the Lord? No. This, then they will know that I am the Lord, is speaking about a very specific time in history when God is going to do a very specific thing. What is the nation that He's targeting in these, then they will know that I am the Lord? Israel. So I think that by doing a synoptic worksheet for yourself, you can lay these next to one another, and then you're going to be able to overlap them. And it is like doing a synoptic gospel observation, where each of the gospels gives you a perspective about that event, but slightly different. You know, they add a little piece here, or they say it slightly different there. The phraseology may not be identical, but it's real similar, and you could tell by the flow of thought they're speaking about the same thing. So that's what I did with these 4 chapters, and I just laid them side by side. It's not in your homework, I know that, but it is a skill. See, this is where when you're developing your inductive skills, you start saying, oh, I could do this, and that would help me. And when you are looking at information like this that it feels complicated, first of all, tell me, why do you think it feels so complicated? What is it about this time when they will know that I am the Lord? Why is it so tough for us to really crystallize what we're looking at? Do you know when this is supposed to happen at this point?
Well, if you study Revelation.
Maybe, yeah. If you study Revelation, you definitely will. We'll talk about that next week, but absolutely. But what does that tell you then about this time in history? When is it? It's future. That's why it's difficult. Okay, so to me, that's the most important thing for you and I to understand. Why is so much of this sometimes so difficult? Why are there so many opinions out there online with all these different pastors and teachers? It's because it hasn't happened yet. And until it actually does happen, we're not going to know exactly, right? However, I can tell you, yesterday in Sunday school class, we were in Daniel chapter 11, and we were looking at that flow of thought about all those the king of the north and the king of the south, and that's north and south of Israel, how they are going to have these different wars and different times in history, different kings that rise up and then they get put down, and then they rise up and then they get put down. And everything is a flow, and you can literally plug in pronouns with actual names of people all the way up until verse 35. But starting in 36, then it says, and then the end time king will. And from that point to the end, which takes you to verse 45 of Daniel 11, you're going, I don't really know. I mean, I can tell that it's still talking about Israel and kings of north and south, and we can still see that it's a war going on and Israel's caught in the middle, but you can't plug in pronouns yet. You don't really know who that end time king is. Now, when you're looking at Ezekiel, you start to say, oh, well, it looks like it could be this, it could be that. You start to add a little more of it in there, right? Again, that's another way of layering. So once we do what we're doing here, I stuck with just Ezekiel because that's our subject of study. The first place you go to when you're doing inductive study to try to draw a good interpretation is let Scripture interpret Scripture, and always let your immediate context rule for your interpretation. So you let Ezekiel explain to you what Ezekiel meant by the things that he's saying. So if you can find him speaking of, and then they will know that I am the Lord, and lay them out together. And I did it in a way that there's enough context of information that I can read the flow of thought and add all the pieces together. That is the best way to get your first step for good interpretation. Later, once you've done this, now you can do, as you said, go into places like Revelation, like Daniel, like even Jeremiah is going to have it, Isaiah is going to have it, there's Zechariah, there's tons of other places that you're going to be able to layer in later for these events that come at the end of the age. But what we are seeing here are things that have not yet happened. That's why it's a challenge. And with that said, I will caveat my whole conversation and for this weekend, the next time when we come back together after our break. We're all kind of guessing. I mean, I think it's a pretty good educated guess. We certainly have the facts. But we're not going to know the exact. So nobody can nail it firmly and say, it absolutely means this, right? And be that dogmatic. But I do think that it's pretty clear when you use Scripture to let Scripture interpret Scripture, you're going to get a better understanding of what the possibilities are. So today our work is going to be to fundamentally break down 38 and 39, just get the flow of thought, the pieces, and the factual information as to what's going on and why it's going on, okay? So that's what we're covering today. There'll be a couple, maybe one or two word studies in here that I'll cover with you. But on the whole, we're not going into the depth of the nations on this today, just so you know that. So don't think I've forgotten it. I haven't. We're going to do it next time we come together for Lesson 4, Part B, okay? Okay. Any questions up front before I get started on this? Nope? Okay, how about the gals online? Has anybody got any? Nope, everybody's good. They're all saying, nah. Just do your thing. Okay. All right. So Ezekiel 38. Let's start by saying keywords. What do we know for keywords in chapter 38?
Day, many days, that day.
Oh, very cool. So you went straight to the time references. Yeah. In the latter years, in verse 8, don't forget that one. That one is interesting because I have heard pastors, because it says in the latter years in verse 8, but then what does it follow on? And it's speaking about the same time frame on that day, right? Yeah. Verse 10, verse 14, verse 18, verse 19, right? And in the last days in verse 16. Yep. So would you, by conclusion of looking at it in the totality of how it's used, is in the latter years speaking of the same thing as in the last days? Is it the same flow of thought? Is it about the same personage? Is it the same event?
In verse 17 it says, Are you the one whom I spoke in former days through my servant the prophets of Israel, who prophesied in those days for many years that I would bring you against them? It will come upon on that day.
Okay.
So I feel like it is.
Yes. Okay, good. Because the only reason I bring it up for you, because in verse 8 it says, after many days you will be summoned in the latter years. Yeah. And he's speaking about you who? You Gog, yes. Right? Who is brought up here. And then in verse 17 he says, are you who? It's you Gog. You should have key marked that, you Gog, because the verse before it says, you Gog, will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It shall come about in the last days that I will bring you Gog, against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am sanctified through you before their eyes, O Gog. Yeah. So he tells you the you in all of those references is Gog. And he says, thus says the Lord, are you Gog, the one of whom I have spoken before. So what I think happens is, just by marking that one key word, awesome, what you do is you go back and you look, you tie it all together, you go, okay, it's talking all about the same time. It does use that phrase in the latter years in verse 8, but it's still speaking of in that day. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And it's in that day when Gog does these things. And the conclusion of these things, if you go to verse 23, again, he's still speaking about Gog in 22, where he says, with pestilence and with blood I will enter into judgment with him Gog, and I will rain on him and his troops and on the many peoples who are with him, a torrential rain with hailstones, fire, and brimstone. I will magnify myself, I will myself sanctify myself, make myself known in the sight of the nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. So this is all going to occur with this person called Gog, and it's going to be at a time when he's dealing with him, raining down judgment upon him, and then they will know that I am the Lord. That's the conclusion of his presence on this earth. They will know that I am the Lord. So if you have done as you're supposed to have been doing and keeping that running list on, then they will know that I am the Lord. You should be able to go back at this point, and I would suggest in August would be a good time to even do that again, just after the fact, after all the work is done and we've finished the study. Go back and start running that, and then they will know that I am the Lord again, and really solidify in your mind, when is that they will really know that he is the Lord? What is that day speaking of? Because is that just anywhere in history, or is that a specific time in history? Okay? All right. So the word, when I asked for keywords, she brought up a time reference, which is in the latter years, on that day and in these last days. They should have all been marked in the same way. All right. What else? What other key words?
Living securely, rest.
Yeah, the word securely, right? I went ahead and even marked anything that was like considered a synonym to that. Okay. Did you catch that?
Well, rest.
Okay, rest. What? At rest. That lives securely. That's in verse 11. Even the word unwalled villages would be securely, right? Right. Or living without walls in verse 11, or having no bars or gates would be also securely, right? Yeah. You can back up to verse 8. Do you see it there?
Living securely.
Yeah, living securely is at the very end of verse 8. But before that, how is it that they're living securely? How did that?
Oh, that is restored.
They've been restored from the sword. In other words, war has stopped for them, or at least temporarily, right? They've been restored from war. So what is restored from the sword tells you then that before this Gog comes on the scene, something is going to happen where Israel's going to be at war because of this. They're going to be having a sword going on, right? Then this Gog is going to come in, and he's going to, in the latter years, come against them then when they've been restored from that sword, and now he's going to attack them. So it's not a restored from the sword forever and ever. It's going to be something's going to happen in history where Israel is in a war. Their swords are at work. then there's going to be peace. They're going to be living securely, unwalled villages at rest and securely. And now this Gog is going to come against them, right? Okay, so securely. You see it one more time in 14. I don't think I saw anything else to me that looked.
12, to me,
In
acquired cattle and goods.
Say it again, 12?
Acquired cattle and goods.
Yeah, well, yeah, that has to do with the subject of the plundering. But yeah, in time of war, could they be acquiring those things? Maybe. So it's a little vaguer, but okay. Yeah, go for it. It's to help you see it. So if you see it, then okay.
So mighty army, sword, troops, horses, bucklers, all of those.
All those warring words are in there. Okay, troops and yes, okay. And I didn't mark those, but you're right. The helmet and the wielding of swords, and that's a really good keyword to pick up on. I like that. It just shows you that there is some kind of a war that's definitely going to take place. Yeah. That's going to be associated with this Gog when he comes. Okay, all right. Yes. Very interesting words, by the way. For anyone that has done any kind of eschatology work, when you see God speaking about his fury, his anger, and his wrath, and then he says in 22, and I will enter into what? Judgment with him. I mean, those are very specific terminologies, and we'll hold off on really drawing a conclusion about what that might be, but particularly that word wrath, my blazing wrath. Yeah. In my zeal and in my blazing wrath, I declare that on that day there will surely be a great earthquake in the land. And he goes, and something interesting to me is in 22, when it comes to the idea of this wrath, when this wrath happens, what follows it? And all the men who are on the face of the earth will what? Shake at what? At my presence. Okay, whose presence? God's presence. So at what time in history is God going to be raining down hailstorms and earthquakes and all these things? And the birds of heaven are going to be coming to eat of the corpses that are on the ground. I mean, this is really graphic. And it really starts setting a stage for us. And for those of us who've done a lot of eschatology, we're starting to go ding, 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 right? So hold on to interpretation, but it's really good when you've studied enough to start seeing those trigger qualifiers that have to do with in that day. And when you know when in that day is, it's really helpful. Then you start adding in that day. You might want to, yourself, if you've never done eschatology, begin a list on in that day and start listing what's going to be happening in that day. What kind of things are going to be going on? What are you going to see? What's going to happen in the elements of the air? And in this case, who shows up? They will shake at my presence, right? Okay. Did anybody pick up on that word sanctify? Let me see. Securely and sanctify.
I saw it in 16 and 23.
Okay. Yes, there it is. There's my keyword. I see it now. There's 1 and 2, and that's 16 and in 23. Correct. So, interesting word, sanctify. It's only mentioned twice. But he's saying about these events that by them, he is going to be sanctified. Now, we need to understand that a little bit better, so we are going to do a word study on that together in class when we go through this. Okay? And the nations, exactly. Some of the nations are mentioned, and then there's a generic, then the nations, right? Okay, I think that in Israel, obviously, you need to know Israel.
Yeah. The land.
The land. Okay, and what is the land? The land of what? Israel. So Israel in general. So with the subject matter of Israel on the land, mark the land and Israel the same, because it's just pointing you to who the subject is, right? Okay, good, excellent. just by doing that much, you've already begun to unpack this particular chapter in a pretty clear way. So now we're ready to say, okay, on the whole then, I think the first thing that you mentioned about the subject of time reference in that day, right? Or in the latter years or in the last days, one of those, right? In that day or in the last days, what's going to happen?
Gog and lots of other nations are going to come and try to
Yeah.
out Israel again.
Gog is going to come against Israel again. So that's a great title for this. Let's put that up here. Our chapter title. Okay, and I'm going to put this because it's a time reference, and it's repeated so much, it becomes key to the chapter. In the last days, Gog, not God, but Gog, right, little Gog will come against Israel. My blue is not looking very good today. Let me try this other one. That one I'm going to get rid of.
It's a really long title.
Okay.
Because I felt like somewhere it needed to be God magnifying himself through this. And I know this is too long, but in that day, God magnifies himself by hook into Gog against secure Israel.
Wow, that's complicated. Okay, say that again.
Yeah. God magnifies himself because this is all about God magnifying himself.
Well, he says he sanctifies himself. Yes, that's twice. Now, where's the word magnify? That was in a verse, was it?
23.
That's in Nick's chapter. Oh, it's in 23? Okay, sanctify.
I guess you could put God sanctifies himself.
I will there it is. Magnify myself, sanctify myself. Okay, and make myself known in the sight of many nations. Okay, so then your subject matter wouldn't be Gog, it would be about God.
By hook into God.
Okay, and that will work. It basically is saying the same thing. I pulled in the time referencing because for inductive purposes, when you're a student of the word, you're trying to first and foremost figure out when is this, right? You need to know the when. So if you add in the last days at the beginning or in that day, which however it would make it suitable for you, then God, in the last day, God will be magnified. You know what? You just answered our whole question to the entire study. Actually, if you start there, there's no need to even dissect the chapter almost, right? So in the last day, God will magnify himself, or in the last day, God will sanctify himself. And then you could say, and you said you put the hooks in the
Hook into God because he did.
Put hooks into your jaws,
It's all about God.
and I will bring you out in your army for God. In a way, it's really kind of cool because we've been talking about this over and over as we've studied this. We've talked about what's behind all this? What's the real warfare going on? We know there's a warfare going on the realm of the earth, but there's a spiritual warfare, right? And who is the real enemy that he's coming against? It's the spiritual battle that has always been present on this earth between God and Satan. And the idea that he's saying, and I'm going to put hooks in him and I'm going to sanctify myself. Yeah. But he sanctifies himself before whose eyes?
All the people.
All the earth, both the nations and Israel. Yeah. Really good. That's very good. Okay, so that's a good title. It's a little more, you have to kind of think about it though. Yeah. It's one that takes a little more, especially putting the hooks in, because there's a lot, that's not a language in English that a lot of people would.
Yeah, but isn't this for me?
Yeah.
To help me remember?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Okay, title we're going to go with.
Okay.
In the last days, Gog will come against Israel. And then what's going to happen when that happens? What's going to be the outcome of that when that happens? Well, and why does he come? And how does he come? And what does he do when he's here? Let's answer all those questions. So we're going to look at verses 1 through 6. Maybe I should use this here. verses 1 to 6 is the first passage. Tell me what you see there in 1 to 6. Who is the major subject in 1 to 6? Who gets presented to us? Gog. And then it goes on to say about Gog, he's got a myriad of people also kind of in his coalition, right? So there's a coalition that goes with him. It says, Son of man, set your face toward Gog and the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So immediately what you find out from the very first verse is what about Gog? What do you know about him?
He's the prince.
He is the prince, and?
God's against him.
And God's against him. Okay, he is a prince, so he is a king on the earth. He has some kind of leadership or power. But God's against him, and he literally says to Ezekiel, turn toward him and prophesy against him. And then he goes on to say in the next verse, in 3, and say, Thus says the Lord, behold, I am against you, O Gog. I would not want God to say that of me, right? But Gog, I am against you, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. And then he says about him, what is God going to do concerning him? Now we know who God is speaking against, and we know how God feels about him, right? But if we're going to try to answer, Gog is going to come against Israel, we're going to say, how does God come? If God's against him, how does Gog ever get to Israel to begin with? Right?
Right.
If God's against him, Gog should not get to be coming to Israel. But what does the text tell us?
He puts hooks in his jaw.
God himself, the Lord God, puts a hook into the jaw of Gog, and he says to him, I, God, will bring you out, Gog.
Yes.
I, God, am going to do this. So who's the sovereign in this? God. So God is going to do this. God is going to bring this man out that he doesn't like, that he's against. And he says, and I'm going to, you, and not only you, all your army, your horses, your horsemen, all of them, splendidly attired, a great company with buckler and shield, all of them wielding swords. He goes on to list them, and he says, and they're all from where? The remotest parts of the north with all its troops, many peoples with you. Now, north, south, east, and west of where? Israel. So north. Now, this is very interesting because if you look on a map with Israel, what you're going to see is there's the Galilee, the Jordan River, and then the Dead Sea, right? The Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. On the other side of that is the country of Jordan.
Right.
So Israel is in this very narrow spot, right? So any country that's going to come against them from the north will come from the north because they have to come in from the north. There's only this much land mass for them to come from. So it doesn't totally narrow down what the north means because anything above Israel in that whole spectrum, they could come from the east to get to the north and then come down and still be from the north. Are you following me? So it's not a total, because immediately north of Israel are going to be countries that are more adjacent, right?
Right.
So just keeping that in mind, keep an open mind as an inductive student is going, okay, but from the north, well, they have to come from the north because Israel has this much land space, and north is the only way they can come in unless they're coming from the south, which would be from another country, right? But this one, they're going to come from the north. They have to come in from the north because that's how Israel is geographically laid out. So he does tell him, I'm going to bring him from the north. And who's going to do it? The Lord will, right? The Lord will bring him from the north. That just starts, all I'm doing is laying down pieces of information so we can outline this. And he comes from the north, and who does he bring with him?
Great company.
Yeah, and north. And many peoples with him, or a great company with him. Now, the reason I chose many peoples rather than a great company could sound like it's his own company in my thinking. So I've changed it to be many people so that I understood it was a coalition of possibly other nations amongst them. Because it does mention Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, and until I know what that all means, but Persia, Ethiopia, Put, Gomer, Bet Togarmah, you know, I don't, until you and I dig into that, which we'll do the next time we come back to this, we don't know exactly what they are, but they all don't sound like they're one nation, right? Sounds like it's many. So I put many peoples in order to expound my thinking on this rather than saying a great number of troops. The troops could just be his own troops, meaning he's a big nation with a lot of people, right? That in my thinking. So that's why I did that. So let's identify this name Gog, though, while we're in this particular one. We want to do a word study on Gog. Just because we need to make sure we understand what this is talking about. 1463, what did you come to see about that for those of you who did do a word study on Gog?
Mainly a leader.
It literally is, it's a leader. And what else?
I saw Reubenite.
What? A
I
Reuben.
thought that he was a Reubenite, yeah.
Yeah, so you went into, yeah, okay, yes.
Reuben's what?
Oh,
yeah,
from
coming from the 12 tribes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Where I read from the line of Jacob. Yes.
A Reubenite son of Sheremiah, Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, right. And it even starts out saying of unknown derivation, I can't say that word. It's of unknown origin. But Gog is said 10 times. The first choice is Reubenite, but that's not the only choice, right? The second choice is, did you see? The prophetic prince of, and then it names some nations. So he's a prince. And in our understanding, a leader, a prince, and that to me, I'm going to put a crown on this because that's going to say kings or kingdoms, right? And any other thoughts on that? So basically, in all then, if we don't go into the first message about what his lineage is, because that doesn't necessarily tell us what nation he's from, even if that's his lineage, what we do know is in this context, he is and he actually even goes on to say that, the prince of. In verse 1 or 2 rather. So the text itself actually even gives us the definition of what Gog is. Gog is a title. Whoever he is, he's a leader, right? Basically Gog is a title of leadership, a title. A title. And I think that's interesting because then that would be, he could be governor, he could be king, he could be president, he could be, you know, whatever the nations call their leader. That's what it is. Gog is a title. Is that helpful? Okay, so I don't know how you marked all your references to Gog and the pronouns he. I put a crown on them. A big what? A big X. Ooh, we don't like him. Yeah, give him a pitchfork. Yeah, Ucky man. Okay, don't ever name your child Gog. Okay, and he says on here, 3 and 4 does a nice contrast statement. Often we want to look for contrast. I'm not going to write it down, but do you see the contrast? The Lord is going to do what? It's going. Yeah, he's going to bring him, but he also puts hooks in his jaw. So what's the contrast there? Yeah, he's against him, but he's for him. He's bringing him, but he doesn't like him. I mean, there's this huge contrast that you can say, he's bringing him, but he's not for him. He's against him, but he's not for him. So that's interesting thought, right? Does that kind of get your brain thinking about this man named Gog, whoever he is, this leader? God is saying, I'm going to bring you, but I am not for you. I just want you to know that. I will bring you, but I am not for you. That's good news, right, for Israel. All right. Okay, that's enough there. I think we'll move to the next paragraph. Is 7 to 9. I just followed Kay's. I didn't try to confuse anyone this time and come up with my own things here. Sometimes I do because to me it's obvious where it has to break, but okay. And 7 to 9 then, what does it say about this man Gog here that's unique in these 3 verses? 7 to 9.
So God comes against the land of Israel living securely.
Yeah, he does. He does do that. And when he comes against Israel, he comes like a storm. Again, it mentions in the latter days, he comes to Israel. But why does he come? I think that's an important part of this. He's summoned. Okay, so let's add those 2 things together. I just put summoned. Summoned by God to Israel. Okay? So the Lord will bring him from the north and many peoples with him, and he is summoned by God to Israel. All right? Now let's go into those details and talk about those points. I don't have time. I don't have room to write the points on the board. They're on my notes. You'll get them. So let's list the things that you pulled out of there from 7 to 9 then. We know he's going to come. You said he is, what was it that you just said? I've forgotten now. In 7 to 9. Well, we know it's going to be in the latter days.
Right.
What else?
To the land of Israel living securely.
Coming to Israel when she is living securely. That's a really good point. Now, he's going to actually expound on that even more so in the next section, but yes, so he's coming, and he's coming to Israel when she has been what? Living securely, but why is she living securely? She's been gathered back to her land, in other words, right? Now, have we studied a chapter where we see Israel being gathered back to her land? Yeah. That was in 37, right? The dead bones that come back to life. Okay, and she's also brought to the land at a time, he is going to come to the land at a time when she has been restored from the sword. Again, in other words, living securely, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why I was saying to you, it seems real possible to me that there's some sort of a major war or maybe some other kind of global catastrophe where they would have had to draw swords of weapons that kind of sets the stage for this king who's going to come against her at that time when now she thinks she's safe and she's living securely and she apparently has put away her sword maybe, okay? All right? Summoned by God to Israel. Trying to remember here, what do I want to do? I'm just going to make a kind of a conclusion statement. He's coming to Israel, gathered Israel on her land, and that she's living in peace, okay? Let's do 10 to 13. Oh, right. Now we get the reason. Summoned by God. Now it says he's doing it to, and in the idea of him being brought, I think it's very interesting in the very first verse there. He says about this man Gog when he brings him. What makes Gog want to come against Israel? What happens on that day? Thoughts come into his mind. Oh, that's interesting. Who do you think gives him these thoughts? If it's God that's summoning him. So I kind of marked a lot of these things with a highlighter. In verse 4, I will bring you out. In 8, you will be summoned. And 10, thoughts will come to your mind. This is all the power of God working in his sovereignty to bring into place these pieces of the puzzle that are going to be necessary to bring this conclusion about then they will know that he is the Lord. So thoughts are going to come to his mind, right? And he says, and in those thoughts, what does he do? He does devise an evil plan. And that evil plan is to do what then? Going on forward with that thought? To capture plunder. So first of all, it's an evil plan. And the evil plan was put there through thoughts that came to him. And when he comes with those evil thoughts, it's to capture plunder. Okay. So all those things are super. So he will devise an evil plan. And I mean, that particular phrase right there really makes me think of a lot of things that, in other references where I see this is all going to come together. Thoughts come to his mind. So I think that's interesting in verse 10. He comes to capture plunder. In 12. There's another really cool little note in here that I highlighted. I went back to my Bible actually and picked up on it. What does it tell us about the perspective of God and who Israel is in this? In verse 12. Where is Israel according to God?
The center of the world.
At this, isn't that amazing? God's perspective. It makes me think of that verse in the Old Testament where he says, and if you touch Israel, you touch the apple of God's eye. God sees Israel as the center of the world. It seems to me like God has strategically placed her. And as I was talking about that map where she's this long little piece of plot right now, and they have to come in from the north, and which strategically sets her up for this, as we talked in Daniel yesterday, this constant battle that comes back and forth between other nations, but they have to traverse through Israel to get to even their adversaries. So Israel, by position on the earth, ends up being at the center of everything. Thus, she is at the center of the world. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so that little tidbit of information is really good. Now let's do the next chapter, or paragraph rather, 14 to 16. He tells us he will come, he who, this God, this man named Gog, the Lord will bring him, he will be summoned by God, he will devise an evil plan, and now what will he do? Yeah, he comes against her. What's unique about this particular segment here, 14 to 16? On the last day, in the last days, he comes.
Cloud to cover the land.
It tells what is she? Like a blanket, literally coming in like a cloud covering the land.
But this is the why to me.
Okay.
Because he said he's bringing them to seize plunder, and the why, so the nations will know me.
And that's it.
So the nations may know
So that the
when I'm
nations may know me when I am sanctified. That's a really good point. I didn't catch that. Yeah, I actually kind of like that. I might change my title. All right. That's a good one. Well, you're right. The so that I didn't, I have it marked, but I didn't key in on that. I do know that he does say in there in 14 to 16, they're going to come. And I guess I kind of tied it back to this idea of the evil plan. The idea, what makes it so evil? Why is the plan so evil? Because how is Israel living according to what we're told here? Securely. So it sounds like they are under the assumption that they are being safe, they're being protected, they don't need to worry, their guards are down, right? and they're unwalled cities. They're
Which is weird.
exactly unwalled and at rest, and so, and having been restored from the sword, whoever did that for them, they are now in a scenario where they think they're okay. And that's what makes it so evil, the evil plan, so evil. And so I kind of went to the idea that he is going to come knowing they are living securely, and that's why it was such an evil plan. But he does that so that, I'm going to change my title, he will do that. Actually, it's not going to be here. The Lord is going to do that. It's not Gog doing it. The Lord will do, the Lord, give me your title.
I did the who, what, when, where, how, and
Mhm.
each one of these is.
Yes, excellent.
And
Good,
this is the
perfect.
why. I just basically why, so the nations will know me when I'm sanctified.
Okay. Okay, so the Lord will bring him so that,
The nations will know me when I am sanctified.
that's a long one, when I am sanctified. I don't know if that can be shortened or not, but if it could, it'd be good. The Lord will bring him, that Gog, so that the nations will know me when I am sanctified. So there's the when, right?
Yeah, that is.
When, but why is up here. Why and when are both answered there, actually. Why he does it, so that the nations will know that I am the Lord when I am sanctified before them, and when they will know me when I am sanctified. And how is, so the question then would be, when is God sanctified? What does God do that causes him to be sanctified? From the perspective of what's being talked about right here. Now, we always talk about sanctification in our spiritual walk with God in the New Testament, under the New Covenant as the church. And often there is a confusion, because we even saw this when we did the feast last week, where we looked at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where in it you're sanctified, right? Well, there is a sanctification that God does by grace, and it's a once for all, that's really affixed as it's an outcome of justification. Yeah. Because of justification, you are sanctified. But then it goes on in that whole thing where it talked about you must sweep the leaven away. You must clean out your houses. And if you don't, you will be cut off. So then there's the secondary part of the concept of sanctification, where we have a work in this. So what is being spoken of in this use of the word sanctification? That's what we're going to try to work on here. Okay, we'll do that next. All right, so in 14 to 16 then, the Lord will bring him so that the nations will know me, meaning God, when I am sanctified. So I guess, can you in that paragraph, can you pull out some points that tell us when is that going to happen? How is he going to be sanctified in there?
Last days.
That it will happen in the last days. That's the when. Does he yet explain to us in here how he is sanctified?
Mm-mm.
Not yet.
No.
So he at least introduces the concept of the idea of being sanctified, right? Now, my title was, he will come knowing they are living securely. So to me, that followed the flow of thought from the first one, where it says that he will devise an evil plan, and so therefore, how does that flow of thought continue? He will come knowing they are living securely. So this tells me also, what's his connection with their security? If he knows they're living securely, they think they are living securely, what does this tell you about Gog and his relationship with Israel at that time? It's a peaceful relationship, and he must have something to do with it. It must be at his power and his control or his authority that they feel that they are living securely, right? Would you say, are you following me on that? I will.
It's like he, right, I mean, at the beginning, it's like, okay, so he does know that they're living securely and he's a part of it, but God turns him about.
Yes.
Puts those thoughts in his head.
What was your title again for that one?
My title was He Will Come Knowing They Are Living Securely. Yeah. Well, I just was doing it from the flow of thought, but I do like the idea that you went who, what, why, when, where, how questions to answer for your titles. Sometimes it works, sometimes not so much. But here's the point. If you're going to do what Susan has done and try to do a flow of thought with who, what, why, when, where, answering those questions, you still have to get your title here, and these points have to flow in. They have to address in the last days that God will come against Israel. Well, how does this answer that God will come against Israel? Maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. The titles that you all are coming up with as you go through this in your personal time, as you're studying on your own and trying to reason it through. I can't tell you how many times I often change my titles. Sometimes I change my titles as I'm typing them up to put them on my chart. I'm not kidding. I mean, I'll get them written up, I'll get them on my page in ink, and now I have to use liquid whiteout because I changed it. The whole point is, what's so cool about this method is teaching you to reason with the scriptures. If my book theme is, then you will know that I am the Lord, the chapter title is, in the last day, God will come against Israel. How does that show that he is the Lord? Now you're going to go through each of these paragraphs and say, this is how you are going to know that God is going to come against Israel, how that's going to show God as the one who is, that they will know him as the Lord. How does it vindicate him? How does it prove to us that he is the Lord? What is it in this paragraph or in these chapters and through the paragraph breakdown? How do we answer that then we will know that he is the Lord? Well, he's going to do something miraculous with this man named Gog. He's going to bring Gog, whom he is against his own people. And he's going to do it so that then when he does sanctify himself before them, then they will know that he is the Lord. Okay? So he will devise an evil plan. He will come knowing they are living securely. And the outcome of that is that the nations will know that he has been sanctified when he does it. I'm sanctified, and I'm going to add on there, when he does it. But we haven't yet addressed what that sanctified is. So let's look in the next paragraph, 17 to 23. And we're going to cover that, because in 17 to 23, which is the last of this, right? Yeah, this is the last paragraph, 17 to 23. Barely got it on here, only because I didn't write very much down, which is probably helpful on space. Okay. In 17 to 23 then, how is he going to, in the last days when he says Gog is going to come against him, how is that going to prove that they will know that I am the Lord? What does he do in this very last paragraph, which is a pretty long one, 17 to 23? What does God do? What is he talking about in there? Judgment. It's all about judgment, right? The wrath of God being poured out upon this Gog. So somehow when God pours out his wrath and his judgment on Gog, that is the thing that causes God to be sanctified when he does it.
Yeah, that's right.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
That is really interesting. So in my wrath, I will enter judgment with him. So he mentions that in my wrath, and I put that in my title because that for most of us is kind of a qualifier that gives us a certain time in history, the idea of God's wrath. In my wrath, I will enter judgment with him. Or you could just say, I will judge him, right? And I'll put his name on there. I will judge Gog. In my wrath, I will judge Gog. And he said, he goes on then, he does make this very profound statement again. In verse 17, thus says the Lord, he actually asks a rhetorical question. Did you notice it?
Yes.
Are you the one of whom I spoke in former days through my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied in those days for many years that I would bring against them who? Israel. Are you him that I spoke of in days of old? Wow, that could take you on a nice long journey through a lot of scriptures. When did God speak of a time that will be in that day, which is the end of the age, when they will know that I am the Lord, that some leader, a Gog, who is a prince or a king or a president, when that man comes against Israel, and I will sanctify myself by judging him. That is just amazing. So title this for me. In my wrath, I will judge him. So now give me some points on this. Tell me some things that you're seeing. When is this going to happen? There's another time reference given to us sort of in this statement in verse 20. Who's going to be there?
Him.
He is. My presence is going to be there. So how would you mark my presence there? We know God in the spiritual realm, his presence is everywhere all the time. Literally Jesus will be there. Possibly that's what that's speaking of, right? So I actually personally, I put a purple triangle on it for God when I read it through the first time. And then as I went back to reevaluate my things, I went, my presence will be there. And that's good. And what's going to happen when my presence is there? How does it describe it? Yeah. The fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts. Yes. They're going to shake at my presence. The mountains also, it's going to be a time in history when the mountains will be thrown down, the steep pathways will collapse, and every wall will fall to the ground. Now, does that sound like a ding, ding, ding moment? Yeah, for those of us who've done Revelation, we're like, I read that almost verbatim somewhere in Revelation. So, very interesting. So, in my wrath, I will judge Gog. And he goes on to give us that. He says, all who are on the face of the earth, of the earth will shake at my presence.
So Katie, are you meaning to say that God is Antichrist? Because that's the only time Jesus is going to be here when he's in power.
Well, that is the question. And it's really hard to teach this super generically without really conveying.
We can talk after.
But here's the thing. If you're dropping into this the first time through and you've never read these things and you're unfamiliar and you've never done Daniel, you've never done a Revelation study, you haven't looked at the old prophets and studied that subject title in that day, then you are at a great disadvantage. I get that. But at the same time, we who have got that behind us, we're ready to put the meat back on the bones. And now I can tell you that in years past, when I have studied Ezekiel 38, before I had all that stuff really well studied, because I've taught Revelation now 3 times. I've taught Daniel, I think, 5 times. Now I really got that well, anchored in my head. I know the qualifiers of the people, the places, and the events. I know the time in history that phrase in that day means. And especially when it says in that day, and it's referencing a time when these things happen, and that the outcome is then they will know that I am the Lord. Because I have all those pieces already put together for me, I am able to now start to draw my own conclusions. And the richness of Ezekiel 38 and 39 now to me are like mind-boggling. I'm like, wow. But let me caveat that by saying to you, many, many pastors I have listened to online do not go there. I know, everybody's giving me a frown like, what? Right. It's hard to believe it, but then again, I do have to say, not all pastors study inductively.
That's true.
Okay, just know that. They don't all study the way that we do. And I'm not saying that makes us better, but I do know that we're being thorough, and I do know that we are making logical connections, and they're objective observation. And for instance, when I do my observation worksheets in this way, and I objectively lay things side by side and just look to see what matches, I did this with the Synoptic Gospels too in Matthew 24, where I lined up Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side. John just doesn't have it in there, so I did Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I could literally go from the beginning where Jesus asked the questions about what will it be like in those days, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. And you can mark systematically, line by line by line, through the entire passages of those Synoptic Gospels. It is exactly the same event. Exactly. Why can I say that so confidently? Is because it's objective observation. It's marking key words and saying this is the flow of thought. It was the same conversation. That's why they call it a synoptic gospel. And that the same people were hearing Jesus say the same things, and they wrote it down from their perspectives, right? And or they were eyewitnesses. In the case of Luke, eyewitnesses who saw it and were giving this information, which is why Luke, I think, is slightly different from the other two in some of the verbiage that he uses. But when you can do this and synoptically lay things out, lay them side by side, you know you're speaking of exactly the same time in history. That has not changed. That does not change because the facts are right in front of your face. That's what happens when you study inductively. So for us right now, when I'm dropping back here into Ezekiel 38 and 39 this time around, which I had only taught it one time before, and it's been 15 years ago. Since then, I've done a lot more. I think I've taught Revelation twice since then. So, and Daniel twice since then. So I have really been able to hardcore lay down my pieces of the puzzle and get things in their order and objectively do so, right? By just doing what we're doing right here today. I'm trying to be as objective as we can by just saying, what does it say? We will talk about these locations that people, and now we'll go into the theories in our next lesson as to who might they be. And that is still on the table for discussion. That part nobody knows for sure, although there are some teachers and pastors who are emphatic about who they think Gog and Magog is. But I'm not quite as emphatic on those points because we won't know until it's fulfilled, right? But we do know they come from the north. And I do know that they can line up with what I see in a couple of other prophetic places that is like verbatim almost. So that's going to be fun. We'll do that next time we get together. But for this week, what we're seeing here is there is a spiritual work of God by his Holy Spirit, by his influence upon the mind of this man Gog, and his intent with him. His intent is, yes, I'm going to bring him against my people, but I am not for him. I am against him. And when I bring him, it's for the purpose of my sanctification. What has he been saying is a key repeated word in Ezekiel up to this phrase. They had profaned me, and what am I going to do? I am going to vindicate my holy name. So God is going to use this man, Gog, to vindicate his holy name. That is the conclusion of this. Isn't that just an amazing? I will vindicate myself before the nations, before whom you have profaned me. I know. I'm with you, Kristen, and I hate to, I'm trying not to, and here's the thing, as a teacher, especially since this is going on the internet and so many people are watching this, and they all come from different persuasions, but until you have really done all the solid work that we have done, for those who, in my circles that I get to chat with and talk with regularly, and for many of you all, you've been with me for 15, Sarah, who just passed, laying in her deathbed, she said, I was having a conversation with someone else in the room, and they asked me, how long have you known Sarah? And I said, gosh, she's been my precept student for, I think, like 10 or 12 years. She blurted out in her coma state, practically, 15 years. Most of my students in Austin have been with me more than 20 years now. So if you've spent that many years doing this kind of study, you see how much homework we do every single week. For one chapter, you spend, tell me, how many in here get your homework done in 5 hours? Yeah, right. Well, I wish. Right. If you get it done in less than 8 or 10, you have done really well. Because if you're really pondering it and really digging in and really marking your words, doing your word studies, and then reasoning through. God says, come and reason with me, right? When you do that, you get to a place where you can be pretty clear on what you have in your thinking in understanding your interpretations. So 38 then, we conclude with, in my wrath I will judge Gog. And the conclusion of that statement is, which is where I went at, rather than doing it here, I did it here. And I said, and then what? What does it say in verse 23? And then they will know that I am the Lord. And they will know that, and that's in 38:23, right? Yeah. And he says, and then he gives this rendition, and I don't have room to put it on here, but we're going to dissect this one particular passage because I do want you guys to catch this before we move into 39 because it comes up again. He says in that verse 23, I will magnify myself. So what does magnify himself mean? Did anybody do word study on that? Okay, basically it is to magnify. Okay, magnify is 1431. It means to make great, to show oneself powerful. 1431. 1431. To make great, to show oneself powerful, to exalt, which is the idea of lifting you up, right? Putting them on a pedestal, right? To show in a state of honor. I think it's really interesting. It's to show him in a state of honor. It isn't to prove that he is. It isn't to show you how he is. It's to say, I'm going to put him up there and I'm going to show you that he's in a state of honor, right? It means glory and high status. That's really amazing. Magnify myself. That's what I'm going to do. When I do this with Gog, when I bring him from the north, when I summon him to Israel to come against her, she who is in safety and security and thinking she's great, he will devise this evil plan. He is going to come knowing that they are living securely, which to me emphasizes that evil plan. The Lord will bring him so that the nations will know me when I am sanctified. When he does that is how? In his wrath, when he judges God. So then it comes to the word sanctify. So that's the next word you should have looked up. And that one is number 6942. And did anyone do that study? I am disappointed. Kidding. Okay, sanctifies 6942. It means to prove one's holiness. So now it's proving it. The first one was to just simply display it, set him up on a pedestal and display that he is. This one is to prove his holiness. And how does he do that? To show oneself majestic or sacred, show one's holiness. And you know how God does this? He just told us. Yes. How does he prove that he is holy, that he is sanctified? When he judges. Yeah. If he judges sin, he will show that he is sanctified. And I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. I love the way that all wrapped itself up. Okay, we're moving fast. I'm going to be done early.
Yay, that's 2 weeks in a row.
I know, I'm on a roll. Well,
It's another Christmas miracle.
It is another. Listen, I love the fact that we broke these things down so that we can take the time and actually, because now that we are doing what we're doing today and get these pieces laid down, we'll be ready to go in then and dig into the what ifs and the who and the why and the is that possibly this or that. Okay, so now let's do the next one. Now, again, back to our basics. We want to look at our key words. That one's 38. I'm looking for 39. Okay, very similar, right? It doesn't seem like a whole lot of change in these key words.
Cleanse.
Say it again.
Cleanse.
Cleanse. That one does come up the first time in these two chapters is the word cleanse, and it's repeated a couple of times here. Verse 12 and 14 and 16. I will cleanse the land, I will cleanse it, the land, and I will cleanse the land. Now, thinking back on what we've studied so far about the idea of them cleansing the land when there's been a pollution to it by the shedding of blood,
Yes.
what is their history on that? They didn't do it. Do you remember when it says the blood has been spilled on the rock and they did not cover it? And that was God's argument with them, is how they had desecrated the subject of blood. And why is the subject of blood something that has to be cleansed when it's shed? It's holy. God used it as an object lesson of the holiness of God, that you would understand it is a high, holy article. And when that blood is shed on a cross for you, you will understand. There's a passage that's kind of dancing in my head. Somebody can help me with this, where he says, it's with the precious blood. You've not been, it's in Hebrews, that you're not purchased with the blood of lambs or goats, but with the precious blood of Christ, right? I mean, this is all amazing. So the cleansing, finally, Israel is going to do what God told them to do all along. When there's bloodshed, cleanse the land. Just be obedient. You may not understand it, but they should have understood it. Actually, they did understand it, but they just didn't obey, right? So cleansing is one of your key words.
And then the contrast, uncleanness.
Yeah, okay, clean and unclean, right. There is a contrast going on there, right. Unclean doesn't become as predominant, but yes, okay. Sacrifice, big one, sacrifice. I love that one. It's very interesting. What is the sacrifice in this case? What's being sacrificed?
This is my sacrifice.
Yeah, it's God's sacrifice. And what is God's sacrifice? He says, start in verse 9, right? Then those who inhabit the cities of Israel will go out, make fires. Oh, no, it's not 9. I'm sorry. Where was the?
It's down in 17.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. There it is. My sacrifice, which I'm going to sacrifice for you as a great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel, that you may do what? Eat flesh and drink blood. Okay. So what has flesh and blood? What's flesh and blood that animals eat? Right? And who do you think this is speaking of? It's all the dead people that are going to be on the land. Yeah, no, yeah. Yes, you're right.
The sacrifice is going to be made there.
Right. This is a different sacrifice. This is the sacrifice that's going to sanctify God and prove him as holy. I will judge God. In judging God, he makes a sacrifice of them, right? Usually the sacrifice is Jesus, of course. But
Well,
this
it's a
one,
contrast. It is, I mean, not a
it
contrast.
is kind of a contrast.
Part of it rather than the.
Right. But it also kind of tells you something about the heart of God in this. How does God feel about the fact that he is going to have to slaughter Gog and all the horde that's with him? It's a sacrifice to God. God's heart is going to be broken, again, back to 18:23. He desires that all men do what? Repent and turn and follow him. He doesn't want, I desire that no man perish, no, not one. But they won't, and so in that case, as much as it breaks his heart, he's going to sacrifice them. And in sacrificing them, he's going to be sanctified. He's going to be proven as holy. Proven holy. Proven because true sanctification in the context of God is when he judges. If he judges sin, that proves him holy. Okay? And then the conclusion of it, after they've been a glutton at his table. Now that's a really good phrase. If you haven't marked it, highlight it. Please do real quick. You will be gluttoned at my table, because that table is mentioned again in Revelation. There's a table that's going to, if you remember it in your head, right? It's called the Great Supper of God. Yeah, remember that? The supper of. and the birds all come to eat the flesh of men. Does that sound familiar right here? Okay, so we'll talk about that next time, but yeah, little teaser, okay? What else? All right, we've done sacrifice, we've done cleanse. We definitely see the birds, that even though the birds are kind of an object, kind of in the midst of it, the reason I marked them is because it does connect you later with other cross references. When you see the presence of these birds eating the flesh of men, it helps you make that connection that is speaking of the same event, okay? So you might have wanted to mark, I drew little birds all over my page. Okay, I did it in verse 4. I will give you as food to every kind of predatory bird and the beast of the field. Do you see it there in verse 4? And then he goes back and elaborates on that in verses 17 to 20. Okay, all right, so the birds are mentioned there twice. It seems to me like it's a significant thing that he mentions it twice. So he's restating it, and then when you go into cross-referencing, you will see the birds again present in other verses. Okay?
I put holy name, glorify myself, sanctify my name.
Yes. Be sanctified, glorify myself, my glory, my holy name. All of those are in reference to the identity of who God is in the work of all these things, right? All right. Anything else? We see weapons.
Yes, all those same weapons.
How about that? About what do they do with all those dead bodies? And starting in 11,
Oh, burying,
burial, set up a marker, and they buried. So there's a whole paragraph in there about the burial. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I heard a sermon this week about this, and one of the pastors said this is the first and only place in Scripture where this much detail is given about the cleanup after a encounter like this. Now, they mention it occasionally more in passing, maybe brevity or allusions to it, but here there's detail.
I think probably at the end time there's not going to be as much carnage as this will be the most carnage there has ever been at one time.
Right, but also it seems like, why is he doing it? Why would he bother? God could just go, if this is the end and it's Jesus, he could just look at them and they would evaporate, right? But he doesn't do that. People are doing it. Why are they doing it? What's the purpose? As a matter of fact, it's not only burial, because he goes on to say they will bury them in the valley of 𝐏𝐻, and it's for a period of 7 months, and 7 is important. And even the name of the city will be 𝐏𝐻. Now, we got to figure out what is that talking about and why. Why would God cause them to literally build a city in honor of this burial site, which he says he will place in a certain place on the map? Did y'all look up the place on the map? Let me just show you. Here's Israel. Here are the seas and the Jordan valleys. It's on the other side. So what country is over here? Jordan. It's over in Jordan, and there's this area right here that's going to be a burial site. And it talks in here about they will set apart men who will constantly do what? Pass through the land, burying those who are passing through, even those left on the surface of the ground, in order to cleanse it. At the end of 7 months, they will make a search. Those who pass through the land, and anyone who sees man's bones, then he sets up a marker. So it sounds to me like it's almost like a traversing place. It's a place where people are going to be traversing through on occasion. What happens if you are traversing along the highway, or you're out sightseeing and you come along and you see a burial site? It's a place of, it's going to be a physical thing that they are going to see, where they are going to see that what happened to Gog. There he is, buried. This is the site. So it's there for whose benefit? For those of us who are left behind at the end of this, that are going to go passing by it occasionally. We will look on it. We will remember that day when God was sanctified by judging the sinners.
I don't know. I don't think I would need to see the graves to remember what
Well, maybe not, but
witness, but I guess
listen.
the next generations, because you have 1,000 years.
Not only that, but you say that, but how many times did God have to say to Israel, remember, Remember what I did. Remember what I did. Because remember, how long is Jesus' millennial reign? 1,000 years. It's a millennial, exactly. That's a trick question.
Yeah.
For the brightest girl in the room here.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so for 1,000 years, and what God tells us all the time, we don't learn from history, do we? Look at what we're doing in our nation even today. Wars and rumors of war. Well, every time a war starts, it's kind of back. My husband and I were talking about this yesterday, and I said it's always boils down to 2 or 3 motivators. You know, it's power, it's money, and it's sex, right?
Yeah.
It's a relationship with a woman that gets these guys in trouble. And I said, and yet we forget. And so he watches the History Channel a lot, and he watches, especially right now, he's really into the Holocaust and all the things that went on during that war. And he's like, the history is there. This is what happened. This is who was in collusion with one another. This is why they were doing it. They had this plan. They had this evil devised plan. And a lot of it also, within the intricacies of it, there were always women. Some woman or another was somebody else's somebody, right? So it's like we don't learn. So why do we need a reminder? Because we forget. Even we have forgotten what happened during the days of the Holocaust. What is going on in America and across the world globally right now concerning the hatred toward the Jewish nation? We have not learned. And so God has to keep reminding us. That is going to be true. Here's a good question for you. We know that we are going to be raptured and be given a new body, and we'll get to see Jesus face to face. There's going to be a lot of clarity given to us. But do we ever become omniscient or omnipresent or omnipotent? Or we don't become gods. We still remain human, right? And we have limited knowledge. We will always have limited knowledge. We'll have clearer knowledge, certainly, but we won't have all knowledge. So symbols to remind us of things are going to be necessary. Right. And I think that's kind of what's going on here.
But the other thing is he's making them cleanse the land because they didn't do it before.
Right.
It's like you are going to cleanse the land.
Yeah. And what I think is interesting is they cleanse it by taking it off the land. They take it into Jordan and bury it there. It's interesting. They don't bury them in Israel. They put them on the other side of the river. Anyway, and it could be that that's going to be part of Israel too. I don't know how much geography.
It's clear that the gravesite doesn't work because at the end of 1,000 years, everybody comes against the city.
Right. Again, yeah, you're right. And that's a whole other story. Somebody have a question?
Go ahead, you're fine.
Okay, good. All right, so now we're ready. We've looked at sacrifice, cleanse, the subject of the birds, the idea again of God being sanctified and glorified, that his name is going to be made holy, the subject of burying the dead bodies of that time and how long that's going to take place is what we'll talk about. We didn't talk about the weapons, but the weapons are also a key word in 9 and 10 where it says the shields and the spears and the bows and the bucklers and all that. I just titled it weapons. Profaned also. Let's see, where do I have that word marked? Well, I get into the iniquity and all that's going on in verses 23 to 26. Do you see that? Iniquity, treachery, uncleanness, transgressions, disgrace, again, treachery. All right, so just those are some other thoughts, all right? Time reference is, again, a key repeated word. Did you notice it? On that day, right? He also says, verses 8 and 9, behold, it is coming, right?
Yep.
And that is the day, there's the day again, of which I have spoken. So what does that relate to back in 38? Go back to 17. Thus says Lord God, are you the one of whom I have spoken in former days through my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied in those days for many years that I would bring you against them? It will come about on that day. Do you see it in verse 18? Then he says here, behold, it is coming. It shall be. It is that day of which I have spoken. So literally 8 and 9 are a repeat of what he says in 17.
Yeah.
Right? It is coming, and it shall be done, declares the Lord. It is the day of which I have spoken. And before he asks the question rhetorically, are you the one of whom I have spoken? And now he's saying, yep, you're the one, and what I have spoken, I will do. Okay, now that sets us up 39. Let's title then this whole thing, what again is coming? Well, I'm going to go again and start my title with about the subject of the day. And I'll let you help me with the rest of it. The day is coming. This pen's no better than the other one. So the day is coming when what? And what is his subject matter? Again, what did I just point out to you as being repeated? In verse 17, he said, are you the one of whom I have spoken? And then in 18, he says what? That is the day of which I have spoken. And so he's reaffirming that this day that he's speaking of is that day of which he has spoken.
Right. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So the day is coming of which I have spoken. Now that tells you and I as inductive students, there's lots more scriptures out there that God has spoken, and he told us in the previous chapter that he had spoken them many times over many ages of time through his prophets. He has spoken of this day. Well, let's think about some references that you can think of off the top of your head where God speaks of in that day. All of Revelation in that day. Daniel. Yeah. Huge amount in Daniel in that day. Yeah. Isaiah. And he's complicated. I hate to send anyone to Isaiah, but Isaiah, there are some really, I actually have one verse that I titled, let me just read it to you here. Isaiah 16:3-5. It's a prophecy of Moab's devastation. That's the title. And he says here, give us advice, make a decision, cast your shadow like night at noon. Hide the outcasts, do not betray the fugitive. This is talking about Israel being hiding in the wilderness during that 3.5 years. Let the outcasts of Moab stay with you. Be a hiding place to them from the destroyer. For the executioner has come to an end. Destruction has ceased. Oppressors have completely disappeared from the land. A throne will even be established in loving kindness, and a judge will sit on it in faithfulness in the tent of David. Who could that be? Moreover, he will seek justice, and he will be prompt in righteousness. This is talking about in that day. In that day. There's one Isaiah passage. I got a bunch of others too.
Did she give those?
No, she didn't give you any of those. I'm sorry. Let me give you the verses, and then you can go look them up and look at that in that day part. Although that first one doesn't actually say in that day, I just know it is because of the fact that Jesus is going to be, ruling in justice and righteousness. Okay, so the first one was Isaiah 16:3-5. That's what I read. 3-5. The next one is, they're all Isaiah. Isaiah 26:20-21. And he literally says, for behold, the Lord is about to come. And then in Isaiah 27:1, in that day, it says, right, the very first thing, it talks about Leviathan, the fleeting serpent. Well, who's the serpent of old? Satan, right? Isaiah 33:1-2 is my last one on here. But there's another really, really good one. I'm going to give it to you. Isaiah 19:24-25, which is really, really cool, because that's the one that shows you the 3 nations that are going to actually become friends and worship together. And that's Egypt, Assyria, and Israel at the end of all of this. Isn't that amazing? And as you're reading so much of these things like judgment against Egypt, and there is a judgment that God brings on her, but apparently his judgment gets their attention, and they are going to, in the end, turn around. The same thing with Assyria. That just shocks me, right? Oh, anyway, so those are some verses. You could spend hours on this. So since we have 2 weeks to get ready, I would do in that day, out of your Bible concordance, just look up in that day. Look at all the references. There's going to be hundreds of them. And go in and just read a few of them. And accumulate for yourself your personal list of in that day what God is going to be doing. Because in that day is what we're talking about here in 38 and 39. And so in the last days, God is going to do these things. And that day is coming of which I have spoken is what we're looking at right now. Okay? Hopefully that will be interesting for you. Since you have 2 weeks to do your work, you have no reason why you shouldn't be able to have time for that little extra homework.
So we're not meeting next week?
Next week is Memorial Day.
Church is closed, yeah.
The church building facility is closed for us. Okay, so now let's go back in and look at the paragraph here. 1 to 6. And I have 2 columns here because it's a longer passage. 1 to 6. What do you see? It's almost a repeat. Remember, the one thing that we talked about over and over is how when we were in the earlier parts of Ezekiel, God kept giving Ezekiel all of these visions about what he was going to do concerning Jerusalem, how it was going to fall. And he would give a vision and he'd say these things. And then the next chapter, he'd give a different vision and say all these things, but they were the same, right? You could overlap. That's what we're doing here. 38 and 39, they're just lapping over. So you're almost going to get similar titles in these things. But what does he say he's going to do concerning Gog here?
God will fall on the mountains of Israel.
He will do what?
Fall.
Yes, Gog will fall, exactly. And he literally says, I'm going to bring Gog to Israel, and he will fall. Okay, so I'm going to put the whole title on there. Now, you could put in the phraseology, the mountains of Israel, however you want to do that. I tried to kind of make them shorter than necessary. And when he does that in verse 2, he says, I'm going to turn him and bring him against the mountains of Israel. And then in verse 4, what does he say he's going to do with him? He's going to fall to the point that what? He's going to be food for the birds.
Yeah.
That's dead. That's like dead, right? Okay, 7 and 8.
His holy name known.
Yes. His holy name will be known. And what will not happen to his name anymore? And it will not be profaned anymore. Did I say that correctly for you? Did I do it the right way on your title? Okay. Because mine's slightly off. Mine's a little different. I just put my holy name will not be profaned, but that could be a subpoint. Yeah. And it won't be profaned anymore. And then he asks that, are you not the one of whom I spoke in former days, in that verse 17 of the last chapter. And then in this one he says, and behold, what? Behold, it is coming. I like it when it says behold, because that's a real big flag that tells you, pay attention to what he's saying here. Behold, it is coming. And I'm going to mark it is, meaning that day. It is coming, because he speaks about in the last days. I didn't put them in any of the other places, but they're everywhere in these 2 chapters. In that day, in the latter days. I heard someone say in a sermon that this first time in verse 8 of 38, in the latter years, does not mean the same thing, but it has to mean the same thing. The whole subject, it doesn't switch from one time to another. It's crazy to do that to yourself. The whole continuity of this is in that day or at the last days. So he says, behold, it is coming. What is it? These last days when God is going to make his name known, right? Yep. All right. And then it's the day of which I have spoken. And that was in verse 8. Okay. All right. Now let's go to the next one, 9 and 10. Oh, yeah. So Israel is going to seize all these weapons and then plunder those who plundered them, and then do what with those weapons? Burn them. I mean, the whole thing is fire, 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 right? Yeah. Israel will seize those weapons and make fires of them. Now, why this particular point? What do you think is the point to this? I mean, it kind of seems like an odd thing to say. And he actually gives a qualifier for the time frame. How long? For 7 years. So inductively, as a student, then I would go, okay, so symbolically, what's being said here from the usage of that word 7, right? Because 7, we know by much experience in Bible study that it means something very specific. So what does 7 signify for us? Completion, perfection, completion. It can also be rest, which I think is interesting, right? Let me just read what I did a little word study or research on it, and it just says that word 7 years, it's used or mentioned over 700 times in the Bible, more than any other number, indicating its significance in biblical narrative and prophecy. So 7 said, how many seals? How many trumpets? How many bowls? Yeah. So how many days in the week? Right. So, I mean, you think of the idea of 7. So how many days did it take God to create the earth? 7 literal days, right? Or 6 days of creation. The 7th day he rested. Let me correct myself. Okay, so it reflects divine order and spiritual completeness found in God's creation and plans. Both his creation and his plans. 7 is used to give you that, convey that understanding, perfection, completion. Also, the subject of rest comes into there. Okay, so 9 and 10 then, he's talking about Israel seizing these weapons, right? Now, tell me, what was your title again? I'll use your title.
I just said Israel will make fires of the weapons.
Okay. The Lord will make us. Yeah, they will. But how do they get those weapons? You got to start there. Because you got to explain how they got the weapons, right?
Yeah, they were going to gather it. They gather firewood from the field.
Yeah. So he actually uses that word seize in there somewhere, I think, right?
The plunder of those who plundered them.
There, I loved that particular passage because why does God come against Israel? To plunder them. Remember, the last chapter was to capture spoil, to seize, to plunder, to turn their hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the people who are gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and goods. So they go there to plunder them, and so now he gives the opposite of that. And again, it's an overlap of information, and he's saying they're going to make firewood of those weapons that came against them to plunder them, and they are going to plunder those who plundered them. Isn't that amazing? So it's kind of like just rewards here, just dessert. Okay.
Oh, there's the word seize. I couldn't find the word seize.
He will seize the weapons and plunder those who plunder her or them, right? They will make fires of the weapons for 7 years. I'm not going to go into it today, but I encourage you to go online and listen to a few sermons, and I will bet pretty much that 1 or 2 of the pastors that you might listen to on this subject of the 7 years of burning of the weapons, what they have at this point come to think it might mean. And, you know, again, we don't know for sure, but their logic makes perfect sense, and it fits in current history. And I do feel like this all starting to happen and unfold for us. So I would encourage you to do that. We'll talk about it later when we come back. Hopefully I'll come back to that, okay? 11 to 16. Again, that 7 comes up again, doesn't it?
Israel buries.
Yeah. Israel will bury, generically the dead, because it's going to, but definitely Gog is there. And they're going to do it for how long? For 7 months. They plunder those, they will burn, and up here they will burn weapons 7 years. So I just kind of wanted to put those references on time there. So you see a reference, 7 years, and here's 7 months. Okay? And if you can clean up your titles and make them a little more concise after we, look at all this together, please do that. That's perfectly fine. And in the outcome of cleansing the buried, after burying the dead for the 7 months, what is the outcome of this? What will they have done?
Cleanse the land.
Okay. That's in 12, 14, and 16. We see it 3 times, that word cleanse in there. So I'm going to give you a reference. Somebody look this up for me. Psalm 106, 34 to 36. Because this is in contrast. We already talked about this when we did the overview part of this. But this is in contrast to what Israel had done in obedience to God concerning cleansing the land. When you're on the land and you spill blood, you've got to do certain things, and they weren't doing it, right? So what does it say in Psalm 106, 34 to 36?
They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and learned their practices and served their idols, which became a snare to them.
Okay, I picked that verse out because it's more generic than just the blood, but the idea that the bottom problem about Israel was they did not obey God in so many ways. They had false idols going on. We saw that. That's why God left his temple back in chapter 11 and 12. They did not cleanse the land. They treated one another unrighteously in their treatment with one another. There's all these things that Israel had done. So here, in this particular verse, he's directly saying that they did not destroy the people even when God told them to. In that case, he wanted them to shed blood and then cleanse the land. And once the land was cleansed, then they would move in and it would be their land. But they didn't do that. And what is the picture in that? What is the picture of what God is going to do versus what they did do or didn't do? Why does God need them to physically cleanse the land of evil people? What is the picture of that? What is that picture for us as far as going into heaven or going into the... Yeah, cleansing the land of sin and sinners. Yeah. Because what cannot be in heaven, when we go to the new heaven and the new earth, what will never be there? Sin. Any kind of sin. The cowardly, the unbelieving, the adulterers, those who fornicate, all these different things. So the picture with Israel, when God brought them to their land, put them on their land, he said, I want you to go in there and I want you to cleanse the land. I want you to defeat all those people. Because remember, he gave them, how long were they gone? 300, tell me the amount of years now. 340 years? How long were they going to be off in Egyptian captivity? Do you remember? 400 years, thank you. My brain, I know. I see, these are things I know really well, but sometimes it's my age, they start to seep out of the brain. Okay, but so God told Abraham, you're going to be off your land for these 400 years, and it turns out to be a total of 420, because the first 20 they were there in freedom, they weren't in their captivity, but then they went into captivity under that Pharaoh that followed. But they were going to be gone because the sins of the Amorite had not yet been fulfilled. Well, they were living on that land. They continued in their sin. And when God finally said, I'm done, he brings Israel out. He brings them on. He says, I'll utterly wipe them off the land. Because they would not turn to God. They had the word of God. They knew Yahweh. There was that Melchizedek that had been on the land when Abraham was even there. They had knowledge of God, but they would not bow to God. They had all these false gods. So this is what this verse is saying. They did not destroy the people as the Lord commanded them. But they mingled with the nations. What did he say? When you go on the land, don't marry them. Don't let your sons marry their daughters. Don't let your daughters marry their sons, right? Instead, they learned their practices, and they served their idols, and they became a snare to them. Okay, so that's what this is all about. Why is this interesting little paragraph in here? Because finally, Israel is going to obey God. And they're going to cleanse it, and they're going to make this burial plot. Now, the burial plot is called the Valley of 𝐿 I could keep this for next week. I've got it on my notes, though, so if you get my notes, you'll get it. But 𝐿, the meaning of it. Did anybody look at it? Okay, it means multitude of God. In other words, Gog's multitude, his hordes, all his people, all those who came with him, right? All those nations that are mentioned. It means multitude of Gog. It's a valley that will be given for graves, located on the east side of the Dead Sea, which is that picture I showed you earlier here with this little pink dot that's on the other side of the Jordan, okay? But it is a future grave site, so it's not there yet. So we have no record of it yet. Well, God is saying it will be there, okay? And those coming to Israel will pass through it. So in other words, its presence will commemorate the defeat of Gog and all his hordes. And they're going to call it 𝐿. Interesting. All right, now we're ready for 17 to 20. Oh, gosh. Ye of little faith. But don't worry, I'm going to slow down when I hit the last part. I got a whole bunch. I'll just talk you through it, though. Okay, 17 to 20.
Birds and the beast will eat the men of war
Yeah.
on sacrifice.
Absolutely. So these beasts and birds are going to eat, how'd you say it?
Eat the men of war I sacrifice.
Eat the men of war I sacrifice. That's really good. Okay. Or the table of sacrifice, as God calls it, my table.
Yeah.
So I put it my table, or the table.
Yeah.
On the mountains of Israel will be the table of God's sacrifice.
Oh, okay.
I put it that way. It's a little backwards, but on the mountains of Israel will be the table. That's a big one. That's a real important title there. The table of God's sacrifice. And I'm going to cheat just a little bit, and I'm going to tell you, go to Revelation 16, 12 to 21, if you want to. And you're going to see in there the great supper of God. And that's the same thing, the table of God's sacrifice. Okay, I think it's speaking of the exact same time. That's my opinion. Okay, all right, now we're going to look at 21 to 24. So I love this. This is all about this is going to be the birds. That's my bird. Not bad?
That's a good bird.
Not bad. That's a bird.
Yeah.
Okay. Or you could do this. There you go. Holy Spirit. That's why I did the bird separate. I did it for that very reason, because that's the symbol I use for the Holy Spirit. I didn't want to use the same thing, so I drew pictures of birds just in a couple of strategic places on the observation worksheet back in verse 4 area, and then this segment here, 17 to 20 to 20. Okay, so now we're at 21 to 24. This is the cool part. This is like we're warming up to the good stuff here. Yep. From that day onward, what? Mm-hmm. From that day, There's our that day again. In that day, from that day onward. I will set my glory among all the nations. That includes Israel and the other nations as well, right? And he's going to set his glory among the nations when he does what? What are the things he's going to do? In verse 21, he's going to do what? Yep, he's going to execute judgment on all the nations. And also when what in 23 to 24?
Against Israel.
Yeah. The nations will know that Israel also was judged for their treachery. So that's how that's how he's so it's really cool. He's not going to be sanctified or magnified just by what he does for Israel and against the world, but he's going to say to the world, look what I did to Israel, my own people. I treated them just like I treated you. Romans 2, go to Romans 2, 6 and 11 on your own, but in there, that's speaking about God's impartiality and judgment, right? Because God is impartial in judgment, and that literally is a Romans passage right there for Romans 2. Okay, now the last one is 25 to 29. And the grand finale of this is now. What will I do?
Pour my spirit on the whole house of Israel.
I will. And in verse 25, I also will now what? Restore the fortunes of Jacob and have mercy on the whole house of Israel. So he's going to save Israel. He's going to restore them to the land. They are going to have his Holy Spirit. Does this sound familiar? Doesn't this sound just like those other chapters? Is just like what we saw in the previous chapters when you line them up. And remember what we did, the last week's homework was we were to go, this is what he's going to do, 1, 2, 3. This is what he's going to do, 1, 2, 3. And we lined those up. Then the next week we looked at the feasts and said, where does it fall? Oh, that falls in the fall feast when God is going to restore them, give them a salvation, and then put them back on their land. So awesome. Awesome stuff. So he says, I will restore Israel. Or you can say, I will save Israel. You can say it a lot of ways. I will give Israel my spirit, right? I will restore Israel and be sanctified. Among, again, all the nations. And then you can go underneath that and list all the things that he's going to do, that he's going to, wait a second, I got the wrong, that's why it was the same title. I will be sanctified. Let me rechange my title. I will be sanctified through them. Yeah, because it's what he does in them and through them. And this is really cool because what this brought me to, and I'm going to try to talk you through this rather than writing it down because, but he said in 39:29, I will not hide my face from them any longer. Now that's very interesting to me. For I will have poured out my spirit on them. So the question is this, and I have a whole section here now. I'm going to take you mostly through Romans 11. But why did God temporarily hide his face from Israel? Because of their unbelief. That's what it says in Romans 11, verse 20. And he says, I gave them, in verse 11, Romans 11, verse 8, I gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to not see, ears to not hear, down to this very day. Now think about when this was written. This is when the church was new. Israel was under Roman control. Jesus has already come, died, buried, been resurrected, and he's speaking to the church, and he's talking about, has God forsaken Israel? And he says, may it never be. He says, but I gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to not see, ears to not hear, down to this very day. So when had God hid his face from them? Well, when he cast them off the land, let them go into captivity, and even though he brought them back to their land, they didn't get their possession back. They never were in control again. Because God says, your eyes are closed to me. You are not obedient to me, and you are refusing me in your unbelief as a nation, right? Because you're no longer acting as a nation who will glorify me to the world, I am temporarily pulling back from you, he says. I will hide my face from them, no longer though. But what was it that had happened? Well, what about after the writing of that in Romans 11? What happens in 70 AD? 2,000 years they're off the land. Talk about hiding his face from Israel.
Yeah, really.
Right? Yeah. I went, oh my gosh, when you put this in perspective to the context, that's 2,000 years off their land. And what is God doing in those 2,000 years? That's exactly it. John 10:16. While God brought other sheep not of Israel's fold, I have other sheep I must bring into the fold. So he used that time frame in history because of their disobedience. God then used that disobedience to bring in, that was how he worked his program for bringing in the church. Yeah. He said, yet, even still, though he has hid his face from Israel, yet still the scriptures say in Romans 10 and in Acts 2, whoever calls on the Lord will be saved. That includes a Jew, right? They can come in, but they come in under the umbrella of the church age, of the church. He says the mystery why God waited to bring in his kingdom. Why did he not die on the cross and immediately take possession of the kingdom? Us, the church. That's the mystery. Why God waited to bring it in? Why the gap in history? Salvation to the Gentiles. It says that in Romans 11:28. Same context, same flow of thought. I'm waiting to bring in the last of the Gentiles. And once they are in, then we're done. Then he goes on to say, because the gifts and the calling are irrevocable. Now, very interesting. The calling is not the calling just into faith, but the calling is to be the servant of God. And Israel was supposed to be God's servant by glorifying him in the world, and they weren't doing it, right? So Israel, though, can be grafted back in, the individuals, during the church age, by faith, in the same way that we're brought in. But God will eventually bring Israel back in its full picture of what he wanted them to be as his servant. And we see that in Zechariah 12, 13, and 14, when he pours out his spirit on the house of Israel at the end of the age, when Jesus comes back to rescue all Israel. So, through Israel, all nations will know that he is the Lord. His glory will be seen. He will be seen for who he truly is. In other words, all of his attributes are going to be on full display for the world to see. Wow. Righteous judgment, but also mercy, grace, provision, protection, how he keeps his word. I've said about Israel, she's going to be on a land and I'm going to be her king. She will. She will. I will make that happen. Israel is God's servant to sanctify himself. He's literally using the disobedient child to show himself as holy to the world. That's Ezekiel 39:27 that we just read. So God proves his holiness by judging sin. There are two verses you can go and look at this on. Leviticus 10, 1-3, and Numbers 20, 13. Amen. I did it. I got done on time. Thank you, guys. Okay, so we're off next week because of Memorial Day. Okay. We'll be back the following. You have 2 weeks. I suggest you do tons of research on all these nations. Look every word up as a keyword and study out for location-wise. Do not be surprised when there's conflict of where these nations are being suggested that they are, because some of them we just don't know. It's a guess. God knows which nations are coming down, who he is identifying as Put and Lud and all these names that are going to come up. Our understanding is this: we don't know because it's future, so we can't solidly say everything, but we can get a pretty good idea. What you're looking for is this. Let's see if I've got my map. Here it is. Israel's at the center of the earth. There's going to be all these nations who are going to come against her. All you're trying to do is, in general, get an idea who these nations might be. Even if we're wrong on the title specific, like I know everybody thinks of Russia, right? But if it's not Russia, it's someone from the north, okay? And what you can do is look at those geographical locations and say, what is in that geographical location today? If it remains the same, then your guess is probably good that maybe it's Russia. But what if the geography changes? Because that happens sometimes. right? We've seen that happen. So those are some tips just to keep you up on that. Do a good title or a good subject study on the day of the Lord. Gather as much information as you can that you have time. Those of you who have done Precept with me before, you've got lots of resource to go into that. For the rest of you, do the best you can. Don't fret over it. Get the homework done. Get all those word studies done. And try to get your geography figured out. Find a map online somewhere that'll show you something like this that gives you a general idea. But don't get bogged down on it, because there is no absolute positivity to any of it, because it's future. Okay? Thank you. See you all next week.